So we're here to do an interview for the Voces Oral History Project. I am Vinicio Cinta. I will be interviewing Mr. George Korbel. Today is March the 29th, 2015, and we are at Pearsall Intermediate School in Pearsall, Texas. Once again, thank you very much for giving us this interview.
Sure.
And okay, so we will start. So why did you get into law as a profession?
My father was a lawyer.
Okay. So where did you go to law school?
I went to University of Minnesota Law School
Okay. What was
in
this?
Minneapolis.
Okay. Was this the same school that your father attended?
Yes.
Okay. So what type of work were you thinking about doing, being a lawyer?
Well, I was actually thinking about going to medical school, but ended up starting practice law with my father in Breckenridge, Minnesota, from 1968 through 71. And in 71, I came down to Texas.
Okay. So what type of cases?
It was a general practice. It's a rural area, primarily real estate, wills and estates. Consumer, that sort of thing. But it's a rural practice, some tort, and just a real general practice.
Okay, so when you were in law school, what was your perspective? How did you see the civil rights movement? How was it experienced or seen in Minnesota?
Well, that's really interesting. I really was disconnected from really television, from news, and from really very much awareness of what was going on in the South. When I went to where I went to college, there was no radio or television reception, so you were literally stuck out in the middle of nowhere, and so I wasn't paying as much attention as I probably should have. But I mean, I was aware that the civil rights movement was going on. I was aware of the Selma March and of Martin Luther King's speech and all those sort of things. But I wasn't really intimately aware of the difficulty in the Deep South or the problems in Texas.
Okay, and what about during law school? Did the civil right were there like faculty or other students who were interested in getting involved?
I'm sure there were. I mean, I can't think of them. Up north, it was primarily the liberals were primarily labor and that sort of thing. So not really so much civil rights, First Amendment, those sorts of early constitutional issues.
All right. So so you finished law school in
1968.
and for the next few years you were working in your father's practice.
For 3 years, I worked with my father. Yes.
So what triggered your move to Texas?
Well, two of my brothers passed away, and my marriage was on the rocks, and the Vietnam War was going on, and I hadn't been accepted, so I decided I would try and do my part. So I joined Vista.
Okay.
And I came down to Texas. I was assigned to Texas and came down to San Antonio. And I worked with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund.
Okay. So can you give us a little more detail about your role or your job with Vista?
Well, I was a Vista attorney, and Vista was very badly organized, at least in that part of Texas, and so there was really no supervision. I was a Vista volunteer for, I guess, probably about 4 months, and then I sued Vista, and they asked me to leave. So they were paying people $200 a month, and they were trying to cut that back significantly because they were spending so much money on trips and retreats and the people in Washington. So I just, the hell with them. So I went to, I started as a lawyer with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. I worked there until 1973. And in 1973, I took a job as an attorney at the Chicago Litigation Center of the EEOC. There is a type of litigation called pattern and practice litigation, and the Department of Justice had that pattern and practice litigation, the authority for it, and it had been turned over to the EEOC, and so they had hired me to run the Chicago office, and I think the idea was they were going to run it all out of Chicago. So I went up there. Pattern and practice, what it meant was that instead of a individual complaining about job discrimination, the commissioners of the EEOC could vote to go after or sue a company without any complaints, but just based on statistics and all of that sort of thing. And so I went over there to work, and shortly after I arrived, the commissioners got in an awful fight, and they didn't meet for a year. So I had nothing. I couldn't do anything. They wouldn't issue a commissioner's charge, and so I had been in Texas, and there had been some movement toward the Voting Rights Act, and so I spent the entire time that I was in Chicago, the year or so that I was in Chicago, working on the expansion of the Voting Rights Act to include Texas.
Okay.
And I was one of the witnesses before the House and the Congress, and I put together a monograph, which was essentially my testimony, which was the case for the application of the Voting Rights Act, expansion of the Voting Rights Act to Texas.
Okay. So when you moved to Texas from Minnesota,
yes.
What was your first, the first instance of discrimination or blocks or obstacles for voting that you witnessed or knew about?
Well, when I moved to Texas in 1971, I went to work for the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and they had a broad practice in civil rights, dealing with issues from police brutality to problems with the Uniform Commercial Code and typical general problems that Hispanics had. And they were just about to file a lawsuit or intervene in a lawsuit called White versus Register, and that I was assigned to do that, and that was really my first exposure to election discrimination, was putting that lawsuit together, or working on putting that lawsuit together with others.
Can you give us a rundown of the White versus Register case?
Now, White versus Register was the first time. Well, we used to elect all of our state representatives in the urban area, and city councils and school districts in Texas. They were all elected at large, and the White versus Register was a lawsuit attacking the at-large elections of state representatives in Bexar County and Dallas County and Travis County and Jefferson County and Galveston County and El Paso County and Lubbock County and McLennan County, and I'm sure there are other ones, Tarrant County, all of the large counties. And what the result of that litigation was that we broke the state representatives into single-member districts where they all are today, and as a result of that, significant number of more Hispanics and African Americans were elected to the legislature. And White versus Register, when it was in the Supreme Court, was the first time the Supreme Court upheld a holding that at-large elections were unconstitutional, and it sort of set down the proof pattern for litigation, and almost literally all of the redistricting cases for quite a while then were at-large election cases, and they used our proof pattern. White versus Register had, in the district court level, had two distinct proof patterns actually. One was in Dallas County and one was in Bexar County. And in Dallas County, it was run by the DCRG, the Dallas Committee for Responsible Government. They nominated a slate, and that slate was always elected. So that you couldn't show racially polarized voting because the whites the black who was slated he got white votes because he was on the same slate, and so people just voted for that slate. In Bexar County, it was different. There was a slating group that ran the city, but not one that ran the state house. And so we had to put together evidence that dealt with, well, we made it up actually. Dealt with statistics on racially polarized voting and on differential in income and education and that sort of thing, and that sort of thing. And that became the proof pattern then for all of the other at-large election cases that were tried throughout the country.
So this collection of statistics and other evidence of these differentials, what was the work like? Who did you work with?
Well, we were the case was filed on the day before Thanksgiving, and we went to trial Christmas Eve. So it was a very truncated piece of litigation. We really didn't have a very good pattern. We didn't really have a good idea of how to put it together. So I worked with some graduate students from St. Mary's University, and we put together these studies on at least racially polarized voting and on the differential in income and the history of discrimination, other sorts of discrimination in Texas, and that sort of thing. Okay. And what the court essentially wrote a wonderful opinion, and it's the describes the history of election and other discrimination in Texas. Even today, it's a marvelous opinion. It was written by Wayne Justice and Judge Goldberg, and Judge Wood from San Antonio. It was a 3-judge panel. What it did was it laid all that stuff out, and so it became the basis for the case then to expand the Voting Rights Act to include Texas.
Okay.
Voting Rights Act initially had been passed in 1965, did not include Texas. And part of the reason for that was Lyndon Johnson was president. That's what people say. Actually, they wouldn't have had enough votes to pass it had the Texas delegation all voted against it, which of course was what they happened had Texas been covered. So for the first 7 years, first 5 years, 10 years, I guess, Texas wasn't covered by the Voting Rights Act. 12 years, Texas wasn't covered by the Voting Rights Act.
So when you came to Texas to work in Maldiv, at what point, what I'm trying to ask is, was there a perception that the VRA had to be extended?
No, there wasn't. But we had filed a number of lawsuits following on White versus Register against a number of cities in Texas, against the city of Houston and the city of San Antonio and the city of Waco and a number of large school districts. And I was concerned that we weren't going to be able to put together good enough proof, and we had bad judges in all those cases, and so I was very doubtful as to whether or not we were going to be successful. And so when I testified before the House and the Senate, what I did is I went into detail about all of these problems that we had, and that became then again the roadmap for what the Department of Justice does then once the Voting Rights Act is extended to Texas. And I wish I could say that I was smart enough to think that was going to happen, but it did happen, and the reason it happened was because these were areas that I thought we weren't going to win, and if we got the Voting Rights Act, we might be able to win.
Okay. So backtracking a little,
Yes,
I was going to ask, how did you get into Maldiv? What was the contact?
Well, I was a Vista volunteer, and I was assigned to Maldiv.
Okay, so it was through Vista.
Yes,
Okay. Okay, moving on to the extension of the Voting Rights Act.
yes.
So at what point did it become a project? You know, the extension of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, there was a woman by the name of Pat Villarreal from San Antonio, and she was worked for the House Committee on the judiciary, and Barbara Jordan had just gone to Congress, and Barbara Jordan wanted to extend the Voting Rights Act to include Texas. She understood much better than I did, or anybody did, what could happen or what would be the value of it. And Pat Villarreal was very close to Congressman Edwards, and as a result of that, we ended up being able to get in really easily. Surprisingly easily, because initially the African American groups, the NAACP and the Leadership Council and all those groups had opposed extending the Voting Rights Act to Texas. They would say, we're going to lose what we've got, and I would respond, who is we? Because Texas wasn't covered and wasn't getting any of the benefits. So in any event, Barbara Jordan and a Herman Baillo, who was a congressman from New York, were the sponsors of the Voting Rights Act in the House, and I think Edward Kennedy was the sponsor, was one of the sponsors in the Senate.
So during the process in which all the evidence was gathered for the statement,
yes,
of witness, was there any contact with the sponsors of the bill?
Oh yes. With primarily with Congressman Jordan. At that time we called him Congresswoman Jordan, but in any event with Congressman Jordan, and also with Pat Villarreal, who I knew vaguely from San Antonio, and she was a very good friend of Rosie Castro, who I understand you're going to interview, and others. Her father was a kind of a political in San Antonio, and there was really quite a nice guy, and he had married several Hispanics in San Antonio who had married English women during the World War II, and Pat's mother was English, so as I recall.
So for Barbara Jordan,
yes,
in her specific case, what type of conversations or exchanges were there with her?
Well, Barbara Jordan was a kind of a mixed bag. She was that's an awful word to say. She was kind of a. There were good things about her and not good things about her, and when she was in the legislature, she initially got elected to the Texas Senate from Harris County, and then came the next redistricting, and she wanted to go to Congress, and so she traded off a Senate district for blacks in Harris County for the congressional district drawn for her, and really part of White versus Register was actually about that. And so I had kind of a bad taste in my mouth for her, but this was something that was going to be good for everybody, going to be good for my clients and for her constituents, and so we worked together. I think we worked together well.
So the process of putting together the statement,
Mm-hmm.
the evidence, do you have any particular anecdotes, going through the state, looking at all this evidence?
Well, it was the sort of thing that we had done before. But if you look at when they first passed the Voting Rights Act, and if you look at the cases that they were citing as the necessity for passing the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, most of those cases were actually Texas cases, and they wanted to have some local testimony, not just by lawyers and academics, but they wanted some local testimony. And I was familiar with the Pearsall situation, and so I got prevailed on Modesto Rodriguez, who just passed away, I guess, to be one of the witnesses in the Voting Rights Act. I think he had not been outside of Texas before, and he thought we were going to Washington State. He didn't realize we were going to Washington D.C. He thought Washington D.C. was in Washington, state of Washington.
So this process,
Mm-hmm.
by this point, you were already in Chicago?
Yes, I was in Chicago, yes, when that was going on. But I had, as I say, the commissioners wouldn't meet, and so I couldn't have, there was nothing I could do. And the person I was working for had formerly worked for the Civil Rights Commission, and so he said, do whatever you want to do until we can get this straightened out. So I did.
And who brought everything together? For example, where did the funding for the research involved came from?
Well, there was no funding. I mean, there was no funding. I think Maldiff, people from Maldiff testified, and I suppose that they had some money, but our people, there was no money. The Congress paid for the tickets to Washington, but otherwise there was no funding.
My other question was, you mentioned that students from St. Mary's were involved?
Yes, they were involved in White versus Register, but White versus Register really just morphs into the effort to expand the Voting Rights Act to Texas.
How did they get involved?
They got involved because, well, I met some of them when I came down to Texas. Rosie Castro and Jesse Boteo and Jean Herrera, as I recall, and then Charlie Cattrell. Dr. Charlie Cattrell was at St. Mary's University. He was teaching there, and he became our expert witness on very short notice, and they helped me put together the election data and that sort of thing. Rosie Castro is the mother of the congressman and the secretary of HUD and housing, I guess they call it now. And Jesse Boteo is a lawyer in San Antonio, and Jean Herrera is has a business, also has a business in San Antonio now. And there were a number of other ones. Those are the only ones I remember. If I thought about it, I'm sure I'd remember more, but those are the ones I remember.
Okay, so when the time came to travel to DC
Yes.
for the hearings,
Uh-huh.
What do you remember? Well, it's a broad topic, but what's for example, what do you remember about the actual trip? How did everything pan out?
Well, the first hearing was before the House, and I thought that went pretty well. And at that point, I don't think either the Justice Department, who opposed the extension of the Voting Rights Act to Texas, or any of the black groups thought there was any chance that this was going to work. And so we got to make our record pretty well, and Modesto testified about the sort of discrimination that was going on here in Pearsall, which was common to the discrimination that was going on throughout South Texas. And and he did an excellent job about that. He was a very wise man, not learned at all, but very wise and so sincere. He was just marvelous. And then the day that the times the sessions that they had when I testified included Modesto and Dr. Cattrell from San Antonio and several others. And then some of the Hispanic groups testified, MALDEF, and the other Hispanic groups testified generally about discrimination. But Modesto was able to nail it as to what was going on. I was saying to the lawyers that I came down with today that I hadn't been to Pearsall in a number of years, and I'm sorry I missed Modesto's funeral. I wish somebody would have told me, but in any event, when I drove into town, I just felt cold. This was such an awful place, just an awful place. And so, in any event, I didn't answer your question. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. This is the actual event, the actual trip, going to DC
Yes,
with
yes.
Mr. Rodriguez. With
Well, he came up from San Antonio. I was in Chicago.
Oh, that's right.
Uh-huh.
So you flew from different places.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Were you with him during this process?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. No. He needed some help.
So from your interaction with him, how was this for him? How was this experience for him?
Oh, he was a little confused about what was going on, but people were assuring him that he had done well and that it had gone well, and so he then accepted that things had gone well. So I remember that his sister went out and bought him I think a kind of a blue sports coat, or maybe it was burgundy. Well, she bought him a new sports coat. He had never had a coat like that, and he had a tie, and it was a different place for him. So.
And how was experience for you?
Well, I'm a lawyer. That's what I do, and I knew, as I say, I knew Pat, and I knew several of the people who were working in Washington, and so and Jesse Boteo, who had helped in White versus Register, by that time was going to law school in Washington. So I knew a lot of people over there. It was in looking back at it, obviously it was a very important thing, but I really didn't see it as that important. Primarily because I didn't think we were going to be successful. But I was in Chicago and I had nothing else to do, so I worked on it.
So from the hearing, how was the atmosphere at the hearings?
Well, there wasn't. There were very few people there, obviously, and I don't think anybody really thought that there was, except Pat. Yeah, I really thought that there was much chance that we were going to be successful. So.
Did you talk, for example, with Congressman Badillo?
Yes, I do. I don't distinctly remember what was said, but I talked to him.
At that point, was he the only Hispanic member of Congress involved in the Voting Rights Act?
Yes, Henry Gonzalez from San Antonio was his entire time in Congress. He was a very strange man. I suspect he probably, well, in any event, he was a very strange man, and sometimes he would be really angry about stuff, and sometimes he wouldn't. And he got mad about Barbara Jordan handling the Voting Rights Act, and nobody asked him, and nobody talked to him, and the MALDEF attorney at the MALDEF office in Washington, D.C. was supposed to sit down and explain things to him. Nobody did. He didn't do that, and so Henry had gotten on his high horse, and he was nasty, just nasty. 'Cause I never liked him a lot myself, but he was as nasty as I've ever seen any human being.
Going back to the process for the
Mhm.
extension. So what happened after the hearing? How was the timeline from that to the actual approval?
Well, the next thing after that was the hearing in the Senate, and by that time, people had gotten the idea that this might going to work, and so that was didn't go quite as well. I didn't think it went as well with the Senate as it did with the House. But we made the record, and the Liberals got the act together, and they were able to pass the extension of the Voting Rights Act to Texas. Still strongly opposed by the Department of Justice and by the black groups. But they had, since Barbara Jordan had such a high profile after the in Washington, it was very difficult for the black groups to be as strong as they would have been. I mean, I think that maybe if I can digress just a little bit, the first time that the Supreme Court dealt with the issue of Hispanics was in a case called Hernandez versus Texas, which was a grand jury case. In other words, Hispanics were underrepresented on the grand jury. And the biggest case for blacks was Brown versus the Board of Education. And they both were in the same term in Washington. And they're almost back to back in the books, those two cases. From Brown versus the Board of Education to until 1972 or until 75, I guess it was. From Brown versus the Board of Education, literally hundreds of cases of black discrimination were going through the courts of appeals and the Supreme Court. None for Hispanics. Next time, after the next time the Supreme Court really dealt with the issue of Hispanics was in White versus Register, after Hernandez versus Texas. And by that, in any event, that's the desegregation in Texas was largely desegregation in schools was largely black desegregation, and then attention was paid to Hispanics when the school districts tried to integrate Hispanics with African Americans. So, but the real impact of Hispanics on desegregation didn't take place until the early 70s. And by the time of the early 70s, desegregation was becoming a failed effort. So, but I think it's important that the liberal community and everything else in the whole country just ignored Texas. I'm sure that's probably an overstatement, but that's what it looked like to me. Had just ignored the sort of discrimination that went on in Texas, and I think part of it was it's easy to poke fun at Mississippi and Alabama and those people, but Texas had money and they had political power, the speakers of the House and the president, and so it was hard to do that, to go after Texas, and maybe that's why they chose not to do that.
Okay, so going back a little. So why do you think the hearings didn't go so well in the Senate?
Well, I mean, I'm a lawyer. I handle, I make arguments, oral arguments, and try cases, and still do that actually sometimes. But some days it just doesn't go as well as others. Some days things just don't. You don't pick up on exactly what the judge or the congressman or whatever it is they're talking about. You don't pick up, when people ask a question, the question that they're asking is not really about the question they're asking. They've got something else in the back of their mind, so that when you answer the question, you deal with what you think they're thinking about. And I just wasn't hitting it off very well. I had trouble with there was a Senator Tunney from California at that time, and I really had trouble reading him or understanding what it was he was. And in any event, it went well enough to pass. And Modesto did a good job, and Charlie Cattrell did a good job. So the fact that I didn't do a great job was probably didn't make any difference.
So what happened after the Senate hearings?
Well, there was they voted on it, and they voted on it in the House, and it got out of committee, and got out of committee and was passed by the House, and then was passed by the Senate, and the president signed it. I mean, it was went very quickly, and it was like, I mean, you anticipate things are going to go badly, and all of a sudden they go really well. So that's what happened. But to integrate what was going on down here in Pearsall, when, as I say, initially the Justice Department had not agreed to the extension, did not want to extend the Voting Rights Act to cover Texas. And when it appeared that it was going to happen, they sent some lawyers down who met with Modesto one day, and then that night Modesto got beat up, and the Justice Department, they left immediately and went back to Washington. They were called back to Washington. They didn't finish what they were supposed to do, and the FBI just didn't get involved. I mean, the Justice Department is sometimes very difficult to understand, and that was a very difficult situation. I was up in Chicago when that happened, and my recollection is Modesto's sister called me and said that he'd been beaten up, and that he was in the hospital, in the emergency room in the hospital, but she didn't want him to be in the hospital down here in Pearsall because the only doctor, or the primary doctor in Pearsall, was a total jerk and racist, and she was afraid they were going to kill him. And so we made arrangements to have him taken to San Antonio, and he was taken to San Antonio.
So we will have to make a pause
Sure,
here.
sure.
Okay.
So.
All right, we start the second half of the interview.
Yes.
So can we return about the story you were telling about Modesto Rodriguez?
Yes, yeah, sure. The being beaten up and then taken to San Antonio, and he never was the same after that. He always had this ringing in his ear, and it was really too bad. I came down to Texas came back from Chicago in August, I think, and I came back to be the head of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund in Texas. And we were going to initiate the litigation to follow on the Voting Rights Act. And I was having a hearing over in Austin before a Judge Roberts, who was the federal judge over there, very nice man. I was arguing, and the judge's secretary comes in and whispers in his ear. So he stops because the judge is not paying attention, and so the judge gets his gavel out and says, "We're going to take a recess." So the secretary comes up to me at the podium where I was standing, trying to figure out what was going on, and she said to me, you've got a call from your office, and you've got to get back because they're afraid that something's happened to your client, Modesto Rodriguez." So I said, Jesus. So we didn't have cell phones in those days, so I went into the chambers of the court and called down to this number that my office, this MALDEF office in San Antonio, said I was supposed to call, to Modesto, and he had killed 2 deer for me, but he had to get them to San Antonio because he didn't want to spend the money to have them put in a locker plant here. So they thought he had gotten beaten up again, is what the secretary had thought, and that's what the judge had also thought. So, I mean, it was pretty well understood that this was a kind of a nasty place.
So Going back to the Voting Rights
Yes.
Act, after the approval and the signing,
Yes.
how was the reaction? How did you react?
Well, I was up in Chicago. I mean, I wasn't here. I was up in Chicago, and it was nice. But I mean, it was people I worked with in Chicago didn't have a whole great deal of understanding about what it was until Congressman Jordan wrote a letter to the man that I worked for, saying that I had, really helped a lot and everything else, and so then they knew what I had done, I guess. But there was a real lot of nastiness with the Texas delegation on the floor of Congress when they tried to pass it, and Henry Gonzalez was one of the primary opponents of the act. He voted against every procedural motion he voted for passage of it at the end, of course, because he was a Democrat and he had to, or he'd lose his committee assignment. But he called me a liar and a mendacious fabricator and a number of other. He was just nasty, just really nasty, and I never liked the guy either. But Bob Kruger from New Braunfels was in Congress, and when Henry Gonzalez was acting up that way, Kruger stood up and said, "I understand the problems that Hispanics have with the language and dealing with voting, because when I grew up, I spoke only German, and I had that same problem when I went to school, and I was embarrassed that my parents spoke German, and they didn't speak English at home." So he was he kind of brought the Congress back to sanity about it, because they didn't really understand the language issue. They didn't understand the language issue, and I guess if you don't live around in a bilingual area, you don't understand that. When they asked me about that in the House hearing, I said, well, none of our ballots are in Spanish, of course, and we had to litigate to allow interpreters to help people vote. And but when the Ringling Brothers Circus comes to town, all the ads are in Spanish, so they know how you attract, I mean, they're the best merchandisers in the world, Ringling Brothers, and they do it in Spanish. So that tells you that Spanish is a necessary tool in South Texas. So in any event.
So once this was achieved, what was the next step? How did the rest of the work to get this applied look like?
Well, as I say, at that point, they offered me the job of the head of the Voting Rights Act, head of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund in Texas. So I left Chicago and came back to Texas. And we started litigating immediately. We had the first voting rights objection was to a statute that was going to require a purge of all the registered voters in Texas. And we were going to start over from zero in an election year. And you can see the problems that you would have with something like that. And that was in the days before computers and cell phones and everything else. So just a voter registration, right, was a really tough job in those days. So anyway, we got an objection to that, and then things started to pop. And I used to buy a Stetson every time we got a voting rights objection, and of course I always give them away because I would not wear a Stetson. But I think at one point I had like 15 Stetsons. I mean, you couldn't do it wrong. I mean, everything just broke correctly, and it was pretty. Those were really halcyon days. So in any event.
So this was throughout the rest of the 70s?
Well, yeah, I mean, we really had we were on the offensive, and the people from the state hadn't really caught up with they didn't really quite understand what the litigation was. We were getting a lot of voting rights objections, and two of the voting rights objections that were the most important that I had talked about in my testimony was the annexation problem that we had in San Antonio and in Houston. And we got objections to both San Antonio and to Houston, and that's the way we forced both of those cities into single-member districts, and through the Voting Rights Act. So, and testimony also included reference to this problem with the purge of all the registered voters and lots of things. So, I mean, it was all of the complaints that I could have thought about working. I mean, those were good days.
And this was working with MALDEF?
Well, I worked with MALDEF for not really very long. We got in a dispute over litigation strategies, and so they fired me, and then they rehired me, and they ended up paying me a couple of years' salary, as I recall, and then I had money. I'd go off on my own, and we had lots of stuff to do.
So after you ended your working relationship with MALDEF?
Yes.
Who were you working? Were you still working with organizations based in Texas?
No, as soon as when we parted ways, I got a call from this friend of mine from Houston, Ben Reyes, who was a state representative over there, saying that the Houston case had been filed, which I was aware of, but that the lawyer hadn't done any discovery, and is there any way that, or hadn't done adequate discovery or whatever, is there any way that I could come over and help him on that? And Jesse Boteo, who had helped me in White versus Register and the extension of the Voting Rights Act to Texas, was available because he had just passed the bar. He had just taken the bar and hadn't had the results yet. I guess that's what it was. So I sent him over to Houston, and he stayed over there for about a week. And I told him, figure out if there's something we can do with this, because if there's nothing we can do with it, we ought to just let it go and start over. And so he went over there and talked to some people. He said, no, I think we can do something with this. So I went over there, and the case was supposed to go to trial on November 1st, as I recall, and we convinced the court to put it off until after the election, which gave us enough time to get some of the evidence together, so we were able to try the case. We lost it before the district court, and it was on appeal to the Fifth Circuit for a long time. The Fifth Circuit didn't act on it, and then Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, and when the Voting Rights Act was passed, then those annexations were covered, and so then we were able to knock the annexations out. Houston needed the annexations for the tax money, and so they were forced to hold a referendum election, and the referendum election they adopted single-member districts. So we ended up successful on that one too, and it's essentially worked the same way in San Antonio. So.
Okay, so you also we were talking about retaliation against people involved with the extension of the Voting Rights Act. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, one that I think about most, I suppose, is Dr. Cattrell, Charlie Cattrell from San Antonio. He had been a witness in the district court in White versus Register. We tried the case several times, and he was a witness every time, and we had been a witness in a number of other voting cases, and had testified before Congress. And in terms of academics, here's somebody that's dealing with one of the most important civil rights cases, expert witness in one of the most important civil rights cases. And testimony relied on by Congress to extend the Voting Rights Act to Texas. I mean, this is really enormous things for an academic. I mean, it's enormous things for anybody. And they denied him tenure. And that was a result of the sort of Brahmin class in San Antonio that ran the city, and the Good Government League who ran the city. And they were really afraid that things were going to change in San Antonio, and they didn't want things to change. So in any event, he lost tenure. We ended up, I think, filing litigation, and they ended up changing the process at St. Mary's so they effectively don't have tenure anymore. They didn't, at least at that point. And he went on to become the president of the university. So all's well that ends well.
So changing gears.
Sure.
Can you tell us about your work with the Texas Rural Legal Aid Fund?
Yes. David Hall was a person who's the head of Texas. It was called Texas Rural Legal Aid at that point, and he was somebody that I knew. And these litigation were becoming more and more expensive to try, and you had to spend so much time, and it was dozens of years before you would get paid, so that it was becoming impossible to handle litigation. And Trala was interested in being involved in voting litigation, and so they had hired me to come to work with legal aid. And
what types of cases have you worked with them?
Well, with a number of voting cases. I've handled a peonage case and a number of consumer cases and issues dealing with Social Security benefits to mentally retarded, or it's an awful term, but that's what Social Security calls them. It's the people that are intellectually disabled. And I've handled a number of those. I've got one on tomorrow. Tomorrow. No, day after tomorrow. Today's Sunday. Yeah, tomorrow. I got a hearing tomorrow on one of those cases. So.
Okay, so in the decades since after the VRA,
yes,
what are the challenges for voting rights?
Well, we had to when the Voting Rights Act was extended to Texas, all of the city we had 1,500 cities or something like that, and 1,200 school districts or 1,400 school districts. I forget what they were. They're changing all the time because they're consolidating. But we had all these cities and all these school districts, and not a single one was in single-member districts, and minorities were elected to very few, very few. I used to say before we tried White versus Register that the blacks in the state representatives, in the state House of Representatives, could caucus in a phone booth, and the Hispanics could ride together in a station wagon, and the blacks and the Republicans, they also could caucus in a phone booth. I mean, that was how small the minority delegations were. So, and that all changed in the legislature when we went to single-member districts. It all changed in city councils when we forced them by litigation through, I say we, Rolando Rios, Jose Garza, and David Richards, and a whole number of other lawyers were handling these cases, and we forced cities and school districts to go to single-member districts, and now we have more than half the population in Texas living in school districts and cities that are elected by single-member districts. So it's a big change.
So there have been a number of high-profile decisions on voting rights. For example, Shelby County versus Holder.
Yes, that the way, I mean, I don't know how much you want me to go into this, but the way the Voting Rights Act works, the special provisions of the Voting Rights Act are the ones that include preclearance. In other words, you had to have federal government approval before you could put something into effect, the election process into effect. And the Section 5 deals with what you had to go through. Section 4 of the Act deals with how you have a trigger to determine who needs to comply with Section 5. So what Congress did was they knocked out Section 4, which then Section 5 still exists, but no place in the country is covered by it. So it was, it was a I used to say that I didn't care if the Voting Rights Act was repealed because, or if Congress, or if the Supreme Court reversed on the Supreme Court. I didn't care because we had gotten most of what we were going to get anyway, and the Justice Department was not doing a good job enforcing it, and they were getting in the way. And but then when they went away, the Voting Rights Act, I realized what a tremendous prophylactic effect it had on jurisdictions in Texas. Now, I think that's really important for what's going on right now. For example, if you don't mind, I'll give you some examples of that I think are really striking. There's a school district over in East Texas, the Beaumont Independent School District, which is in Jefferson County. And Beaumont Independent School District was essentially taken, the blacks finally became the majority in the Beaumont Independent School District. And the first thing that was done after they took over was there was an election, and at the election they changed from single-member districts to a mixed plan of at-large elections and single-member districts in which there would still be blacks on the board, but the whites would then control the board again. That litigation over that went on for the last 3 years or so, and when the Voting Rights Act went away, that went away, and the first thing that the Texas Education Agency did was they went in and deposed the board, took over the school district, appointed a master to run the school district. And while they had the power to do that, the Justice Department would have had to approve it under Section 5. Without Section 5, all sorts of things were happening. So in any event, essentially the TEA changed the majority of the board from black to white. And that would never have happened. Number of cities and school districts are changing. These are places where we litigated, are changing from all single-member districts to these mixed plans where minorities can still be on the board, but they wouldn't be meaningful anymore. The Anglos would then take back over control. And so, and that's in the process of happening in a lot of places.
So with all of these implications for that change, what can be done about it?
Well, the proposal for Congress, there are all sorts of things have been talked about. One thing would be if there were a certain number of findings of election discrimination against a state in the period of 10 years or 15 years, depending on what the concept was, but it's essentially the same concept, then the whole state would be covered. And they'd be covered until there were no longer 3 or 4, whatever the standard is, there were no longer those many findings, so that if all the findings took place in the current year, then it would take them 15 years to get out from under the Voting Rights Act. And the idea was that if the state was covered, then all the jurisdictions in the state would be covered. But that didn't go anyplace, and so then they came up with a concept that they're fooling around with now, and under that, the states would be covered, but not the individual jurisdictions. You would have to have findings of election discrimination against individual jurisdictions. Well, now, those are really hard to get. Most of these places we've already gotten single-member districts, so we're not going to get that finding. And litigating other issues on election discrimination just doesn't happen, or very seldom happens. So under the way they're proposing it, or the way it's now being talked about, virtually no place in Texas other than then the state would be covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which would be, I mean, better than nothing, but you know, politics is local, and the most important things about people who fix your streets and the drainage and everything else, that's all comes on a local level. So, in any event, I'm not real optimistic that, but then I wasn't optimistic that it would pass to begin with. But I'm not really optimistic that any change is going to be made in Washington today is going to make any difference. And frankly, I kind of hope that they don't make a change, because maybe in a little while Congress won't be quite as nasty toward each other, and maybe then, you know, something could really be worked out. But I mean, I don't think we're getting much out of it now. We'd be getting much out of it now.
Do you think there will ever be a moment in which voting rights laws will not be necessary?
Yes. In fact, I could show you charts. The Hispanic growth in the state is, and African American growth too, but primarily Hispanic growth is just absolutely amazing. For example, Texas grew by 4 million, almost 5 million people, I think, in the last decade, and 90% of that growth was minority. And now the Anglo population is essentially flattened out, and they will be flattened out through 2040 and 2050, all the projections that the state makes. And Anglos are now 44% of the population. By the middle of the next decade, Hispanics are going to be in the majority in the state. And if you recall, in California, California was a Republican state until minorities became a majority of the population, and then it flipped over to becoming instead of being a very conservative state, becoming a progressive and now very liberal state. And Texas, in California, of course, you get more Anglos voting, but for the Democratic Party or for liberal parties. And in Texas, we don't have that many Anglos, so the minorities have to get a little higher percentage than they had in. But I've been expecting that minorities are going to start taking over the state. For example, half the population in Texas now lives in counties in which the Democratic candidate for president carries half the population. There's a differential in turnout, but if half the population lives in those counties now, more than half every year lives there, and at some point in time you got a tipping point in which everything goes the other direction, and in which Texas then becomes, instead of the most conservative state, probably one of the most liberal states in the Union. So, but that's not happening as fast as I would like to see it. So.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Now the next few questions, we will go back to several things that
Okay.
you mentioned.
Okay.
Just to go back to them. You mentioned
Sure.
you tried to enlist to go to Vietnam.
No, I was drafted.
You were
Drafted when I was a third-year law student. All of the exemptions went away, and they just drafting everybody. And so my number came up, and I was drafted. But I had played college football, and almost no one who plays college football could be in the military. They were either 4F or 1Y because they had problems with their knees or with their shoulders or something like that. And so there were almost no football players in Vietnam. And so in any event, I went to the draft. I brought along my X-rays to show, because what I was worried about is I was going to get drafted, going to go over and spend 3 or 4 months, and then they decided that I washed me out, and I would have lost my third year in law school. But I always felt bad that because a very large percentage of my class got drafted out of law school, and I always felt kind of bad about that. So, in any event.
Another question I wanted to return to. So, when you moved to Texas from Minnesota,
yes,
how was that change for you? How did you experience that shift?
Well, the area in Minnesota that I lived in is very much like West Texas. There's oil and cattle and farming, and the people all have similar values. They're not racist. Here they are, but the same sort of values that rural people have. And so Texas was very much like where I grew up. It's warmer here in the summer, but it gets very warm in Minnesota, just not as many days. But in any event.
So that area of Minnesota, when you were growing up, where was there a considerable population of African Americans?
No, there were no African Americans at all. There were a lot of Hispanics, but they were primarily migrants, and the migrants hadn't started staying. Now there's a large Hispanic population because when the migratory stream stopped, there were no then jobs, so they ended up stranded, and now make a significant portion of the population in North Dakota and the western portion of Minnesota. So, but it's different now than it was then.
So it was in the local environment. Was there any perception at all of African Americans and Latinos back then? Like, did they figure?
Well, yes. I mean, my family were several members of my family were farmers, and they hired a lot of migrants, and so I was around migrants my whole life, and I remember the girls and those families all had, my families all had their ears pierced by the migrants, and the migrants always brought watermelons early. We only would have watermelons for a short period of time in Minnesota, but they would bring watermelons and onions, and so because they go back to the same people every year. So in any event, there were a lot of migrants then.
Did you personally interact with migrant workers?
Oh, sure, of course. I mean, they had children, and I mean, I was a child, and they were children, and played with them, and yeah. So.
Okay. Another thing, when you were doing all the research and all the evidence gathering, did you learn Spanish to work here in Texas?
I don't speak Spanish very well. No, I don't.
Was a general procedural question that I had.
Sure.
Let me go through the rest of the questionnaire to see what other gaps we have. I've got a list of cases because I think it's going to become important if and when Congress ever begins to deal with the Voting Rights Act again. And we have now, in the past 15 years, more than 100 findings of election discrimination against Texas jurisdictions, the state, or jurisdictions within the state. So there really is no change, no significant change, I don't think, in most of the parts of Texas. So. No significant change, as in the same pattern of discrimination?
Same patterns of discrimination. And the thing the most impressive to me is how little change there has been in the socioeconomic information between the 70s when I first started looking at it, at least, and 2010. I mean, you've still got the same differential between Hispanics and Anglos, and between blacks and Anglos that we saw 40 years ago. The other point I think is really important to think about in terms of growth is that when I came to Texas, there were about 2 million Hispanics in Texas, and there were a lot of Hispanics in Texas. Now there are 2 million Hispanics, almost 2 million Hispanics in Harris County, and it went from 2 million to close to 10 million now. So it's a big change, and that growth, if I could show you these charts, that growth just continues on. in 2040 in Harris County is going to have more Asians than there are whites in Harris County. And in Dallas County will almost be the same way. And when I came to Texas, Dallas County was the whitest place. I mean, I grew up in all white area, but Dallas County was the whitest place I'd ever seen, big city I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, there were no blacks downtown. You didn't see anything. And now it's become a very progressive county, and by 2040 will be very few whites living in the county. Big changes.
Okay. Do you have something else that you would like to add?
Well, I really think it's important. All of these, Rolando Rios and Jose Garza and David Richards and all sorts of, there's a Don Gladden and all sorts of other lawyers that really did much more than I did. I was lucky. I lucked into most of the litigation, and we were successful, and things fell together. And when they fell together, people thought that I knew what I was doing, and even I believed it for a while. So, but there were other lawyers. The state was, such big changes have taken place because of all this voting litigation. So, in any event.
Now that you bring that up, now that with all the challenges, and like you said, if several patterns still are still prevalent,
Mm-hmm.
how about the younger generations of attorneys who will pick up all this work?
Oh, when I first started down here, it wasn't very popular to be involved in civil rights. I mean, that was not a very big, it was hard for lawyers to do that. Now it's easier. I mean, it's easier. And there are lots of younger lawyers. I mean, and they're all much better trained, and at my age they read much better and argue much better than I do, and so I don't think there's any problem with that. The problem is with the federal judiciary and with Congress. That's with the state legislature. Those where the problems are. The lawyers are fine, and I'll give you an example of that. We tried last year or 2 years ago, whatever it was, the voter ID statute in Washington, before a 3-judge court in Washington it was a Section 5 lawsuit. And we also tried it here and we tried here in San Antonio, here in Texas, I should say, and we tried the voting rights, the redistricting of the legislature here in San Antonio and in Washington. The judges in Washington were incensed by the stunts that the state had pulled. And the judges down here, what's new? I mean, it goes on all the time. In losing the ability the litigation ability in D.C. under the Voting Rights Act is a big loss, because we're dealing with judges, and the judges are not nearly as good as what we used to have. That's not true for everybody, obviously, but for many that's true. So.
Okay, let's just to wrap up.
Okay.
What would you say, to put it in a few words, or as many as one? What has been your main achievement? What do you think has been your main achievement as a civil rights attorney?
I'm 73 years old, and I made it that far. So I think that's my. I don't see anything as achievements. I mean, there's been a lot of changes, but that's what I do as a lawyer. That's what I do as a lawyer. So.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Sure enough. And let me know if there's anything I can do to. Anything else.